Praise and honor to you, O Lord Jesus Christ. Praise and honor to you, O Lord Jesus Christ. From the shining cloud, the Father's voice is heard. This is my Son, my beloved Son. Listen to him. Praise and honor to you, O Lord Jesus Christ.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, conversing with him. Then Peter said to Jesus in reply, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud cast a shadow over them. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell prostrate and were very much afraid. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise, and do not be afraid. And when the disciples raised their eyes, they saw no one else but Jesus alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus charged them, Do not tell anyone of the vision until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Hail Mary, full of grace.
The Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Jesus took Peter, James, and John, his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Today is Safe Haven Sunday, designated so by Archbishop Coakley. And the reason being is because we want to create a safe haven within our homes in order that God may be more readily encountered by each of us, but especially by our children. The problem of pornography, as St. John Paul II said, is not that it shows too much, but that it reveals too little. And what he means by that is that pornography does not demonstrate the person behind the image. And so when we or our children, God forbid, or whomever takes part in this, not only is it to the degradation of the person, but it also blinds the inner vision of our souls. I'll come back to this idea and how it is that we might create our homes to be a safe haven in this regard. But I just want to point out one statistic, is that most children nowadays, the average age for their first exposure to pornography is 11 years old. So if you have a child who's older than 11, and you wondered if they've ever been exposed? It's almost certainly yes. And it's an uncomfortable topic, but we need to learn how to speak about it with confidence, with truth and love. And if we ourselves struggle with it, to find the necessary resources. Okay, but I want to tie this to the gospel, especially this idea of vision. It says here that Jesus was transfigured before them. The transfiguration is kind of the preeminent moment in the Gospels where Jesus is revealed as divine, as God. Why is that? Well, as is kind of a typical trope that we see in the scriptures over and over again, God is encountered on the mountaintop. Moses received the law of God from Mount Sinai. Elijah went up the same mountain in order to see God. Moses first encountered God on a mountain in the burning bush. This kind of mystical experience, is engaged at an elevated level. What do I mean by mystical? This word mysticism, mystical, it's kind of thrown around in the tradition of the church. But what does it actually mean? Here is a definition perhaps that gets to it. It is an experience of the extraordinary in the ordinary. And a conviction that the spiritual, the extraordinary, is far greater, more grand, and more beautiful than merely the ordinary. I feel bad for agnostics, atheists, and I don't mean it like in a condescending, like, I feel bad for you. No, because agnostics and atheists have in large part cut themselves off from the opportunity to experience the mystical, where out of the corner of our eyes we catch a glimpse of the divine, where we see that past this pale veil of the ordinary, there is something extraordinary, something beyond merely this life. And so Jesus takes his disciples up a mountain. Why, though, a mountain? Why isn't God ever encountered in the swamp? Well, because he's not. And it really wouldn't sound very poetic. But God is encountered on a mountaintop. Who here has climbed a mountain? Raise your hand. Or a very tall hill and been able to see for miles and miles. You get a perspective that you would not otherwise be able to see or encounter when you were in such an elevated position. You can now see, if you will, from the vantage point of God, to see how everything is now related and connected to each other. This is to start to get at the idea of what is mystical. Have you ever had that moment of clarity, where everything just sort of came together in your mind? Okay. And it says then that he was transfigured before them. Transfigured comes from the Greek word metamorphose. It's the same word that we get metamorphosis from, in order a changing, a revealing past what it was before. The mountain beyond the mountain, or the river beyond the river. It is the revelation of the divine behind the humanity of Jesus, now fully visible. It is the resurrection past the crucifixion. Jesus is being changed before them. And now they can see with true vision. Remember I mentioned earlier how pornography and other vices blind the vision of our souls to being able to see what is beyond the ordinary. Okay. And then it says, his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Perhaps some of us have had the wonderful experience of being in a very dim room, struggling to read something. Maybe you're reading a newspaper and you can't quite make out exactly what it's saying. Or maybe there's a sign at a distance. And then someone turns a light on. And now you can see with clarity what before you could not see. This is getting at sort of this mystical revelation, right? That now we can see with the light of faith what was before hidden. Okay. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them. Which we could say more about that. Moses and Elijah were the only two to go up a mountain and encounter God and see his glory revealed from the Old Testament. And so here now, they were not able to see the face of God during their lifetime. But now they go up the mountain, or they are there on the mountain with Jesus, and they can now behold God face to face in the person of Jesus Christ. Okay. And then it says to Peter said to Jesus in reply, Lord, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, if you wish. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Sometimes people ask, how did they know it was Elijah and Moses? Well, clearly it was because of their big flowing beards. That's how they knew. But the text doesn't actually say that. Now, it says, Peter says, let's build 3 tents. And sometimes poor Peter is kind of scolded for this desire to just sort of stay there in that moment. If you've ever had an experience, if you will, of the transcendent, and I believe all of us at some point in our life have experienced this mystical moment, a realization that there is something extraordinary beyond the mere ordinary. If we just scratch the surface of this life, something else is revealed. And Peter wants it to last, but what we know is that the mystical is fleeting. It happens for a moment, but it does become the place oftentimes of worship. This realization of the presence of God and the need to bow down and worship. You see, when he says, let us construct 3 tents, you could also say booths. And there was a feast of booths that the Jewish people celebrated. It was also called the Feast of Tabernacles. It harkens back to this temple within the tent, where God's glory would come down amongst the Israelite people. And that was the privileged place of encounter and worship. And so what Peter is saying is, let us build a tent on this site. Let us stay here and worship. And we do this even now in our present day, right? We construct magnificent structures, beautiful basilicas all over the world, especially in places where there has been a privileged encounter with the extraordinary, where God has revealed himself in some way. I think of God's intervening through the revelations from our Blessed Mother. Think of Guadalupe, where a church was built on that site. Think of Lourdes, where Bernadette encountered Mary, where there is still to this day a church. These holy places of encounter where once having been revealed men are compelled to bow down and thank God. Okay. And then it says, while he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud. Remember the Shekinah? The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night that led the Israelite people through the desert. A bright cloud cast a shadow over them, and from the cloud came a voice. The voice. This is used again and again by the mystics of the church. This realization that there is a personal God speaking to the hearts of each and every one of us. Many of the mystics of the church describe this voice speaking within them. I think of St. Augustine right before his conversion moment, when he was in the garden and he hears a voice that says, "Take up and read." He takes up this book and he reads this passage of Scripture, and his life is changed forever. And now we have one of the greatest theologians of all time, but preceded by the still small voice of God speaking in his heart. That's just one example of numerous. We must listen for that still small voice. I'm going to share a little bit of my own personal experience, which I don't usually do when preaching, but I think it's appropriate, just to kind of convey what I mean by this mysticism, but it is personal. It's a part of our own experience. So when I was in college seminary, I had 3 wonderful years there. I made many friends. I loved my time there. And it was graduation day. And I was feeling really, really low, because I knew that saying goodbye was imminent, that I would soon have to leave this place that had meant so much to me, that had been so formative. And I would say goodbye to many friends who I had made, some of whom I would probably never see again. And I have, and this is the way that the Lord has spoken to me. And it might sound kind of goofy, but it's my mystical experience, not yours. So it's okay if it's goofy to you. For me, it's it's the extraordinary beyond the ordinary. God has spoken to me through the imagery of clouds. I told you it was weird. I love what I like to call Toy Story clouds. You know, those nice little puffy cumulus clouds kind of spread out over a beautiful blue sky with the sun shining. Kind of picturesque, what you see at the opening credits of Toy Story. Anyway, if you want to know, just look up Toy Story. Anyway, and so there I was very low, and I was taking a box of stuff to put in my car. I was getting ready, for the ceremony later that afternoon, and I would leave. And I hadn't been, when you're down, your eyes are usually down. You're downcast. And I just had this moment where I looked up, and I saw, for the first time that day, it was a beautiful, bright blue sky. The sun was shining, and there were these puffy little white clouds, just picturesque and spread out all over. And then in that moment, I knew deep within my soul and heard speaking in my heart, this all is a gift. Everything is a gift. This time here, your friends, this time in seminary, and I knew with deep conviction in that moment, right, that mystical experience, that all of this life is truly a gift from God. If someone had walked up to me with a white-hot brand and said, "You have to renounce that there is any possibility that there is anything extraordinary beyond just this life," I would have said, "Put it right through my heart, because I'm not going to renounce it. I believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that this life is a gift."
And, as the mystical experience fades, my conviction and confidence might fade a little bit, but I can always go back to that and recall that moment when God, in a personal way, revealed in these clouds that this life is a gift. So that we would have true vision, that we would be able to see with the eyes of our soul that which is hidden, and to make our homes a safe haven for that. So to loop it back to what I said I would do at the beginning, we have some handbooks printed by Covenant Eyes that has to deal with this problem of pornography. How do you address this topic with your children or your grandchildren, or maybe the children whose guardianship you've been entrusted with? It can be an uncomfortable and difficult conversation, but it is so necessary and worth it that we preserve the true spiritual vision of our most innocent, and that we seek by the grace of God to regain that vision ourselves. So today, let us open our hearts and our minds and raise our eyes to the heavens, where God is revealing His transfigured Son. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him."